Hello, I hope everyone is doing well today. And thank you so much for being here and spending your Wednesday afternoon with us, or your lunch hour with us. Um, Let me make sure the attendants are in. The attendees are, yes, it's on. Perfect. So a few are still coming in, but thank you so much for being here today. If you have any questions or comments, please drop it in the chat and we'll try to get it answered at the end. Dr. Gabrielle has been really great working with us and has really spent a lot of time dedicated to this. So just thank you for her coming out today. And I'll go ahead and give her bio and then let it get started. So Dr. Gabriella Howell completed her doctoral thesis in 2024, focusing on influence of the 1700s Antiguan planters on the development of North Carolina and Virginia. Specifically, her research was on Francis Farley and his heirs as a representation of a wider planter society in Antigua, the reason for their movement in North Carolina and Virginia, and the influence they exerted. Dr. Howell is the Director of Historic Preservation within the Heritage Trust Incorporated in Antigua and Barbuda. Notably, she has played a pivotal role in the restoration efforts at the Government House of Antigua and Barbuda, having authored the master plan and leads the relationship development for the museum establishment. Dr. Howell is working in the partnership with the Museum of London Docklands and the Irish government to bring Entangled Island exhibition, showcasing the historical connections between Ireland and Antigua to the newly established museum opening of winter 2025. Furthermore, Dr. Howell has contributed the cultural sector through her trustee position with the Cardiff Story Museum in Wales, UK, and the Royal Engineers Museum, UK, gaining insights into museum operations and the importance of cultural heritage in shaping collective identity. So,
Fantastic.
thank you so much. I will give the floor to you. Again, any comments, questions, please leave them in the chat.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cameron. I hope everyone can hear me nice and clear from Antigua. Hello, as Cameron just said, I'm Gabriella Howell, and thank you for joining me today for my presentation on Francis Farley, his heirs, and their influence from the Caribbean island of Antigua on the development of North Carolina and Virginia in the 1700s. I'd like to start off by thanking CJ Idle and the Museum of Rockingham County for hosting this presentation today. I travelled to Rockingham County in January 2024 as part of my doctoral thesis into the influence of the Farley family in the region. I'd been reading about Charles Rodderberg's work on the Surreytown community and DNA tracing he proposed. Much of Mr. Rodderberg's research was relevant to my study into the influence in North Carolina and Virginia. My sister and I, as you can see from the picture, she accompanied me on a 10-hour drive from Nashville at the same time. Of those of you who live in the area may remember a very large snowstorm hit. This is in January 2024. Again, as many of you in the area may know, the museum was undergoing extensive repair work, which meant the heating was not functioning. Mr. Idle was very generous with providing us access to the museum, sitting with us and in our hats and gloves, reviewing Mr. Rodderberg's extensive research material. Charles Rodderberg's research on the Surreytown project is fascinating. Rodderberg's research resulted in two self-published works in 2013 entitled Understanding the Flow of Ancestry and Settled, Family Journey Through Slavery. His work on the connections between Antigua and Virginia, particularly pertaining to 100 enslaved people moved by Francis Farley from Mercers Creek to North Carolina and Virginia, are discussed. I note in my thesis, and again now, that I hope the research he started in tracing the ancestors of the Surreytown community, who originated from the Mercers Creek estate in Antigua, continues. The idea of this research showcased how small our world really is, then and now, and the connections we have to one another. The key aim of my research is to present the impact of an Antiguan sugar plantation family over the rapidly changing colonies of North Carolina and Virginia in the 1700s. Academic research on the history of the Caribbean is predominantly written from a Eurocentric perspective, associated with the Imperial British School of Historical Writing, or through an American-centric lens. In comparison, there is little research undertaken on the Caribbean people. Francis Farley and his family are used as an example, a microcosm of society as a whole, to present the influence of a Caribbean family from Antigua on the North American colonies, specifically North Carolina and Virginia. It should be noted here that when I reference the Farleys as a Caribbean family through as a Caribbean family, these Caribbean colonialists were originally British, with historic British methods of working and thinking. There is more to be researched regarding the colonialists who were born, worked, lived, and died in the Caribbean. Though not native to the islands as the people before them in the Siboney, Arawak, and Carib people, the influence of the lifestyle factors, natural conditions, and influence of neighbouring colonies, combined with the methods of sugar work undertaken and missionaries' influence, accumulate to produce a unique person, different to their English counterparts. Arguably desperate to retain their Englishness, the lifestyle of the generational Caribbean landowner was unique. The difference was noticeable to the true English, who perceived themselves as having a superior social status than those born, educated, and eventually died on the islands. Now, the island of Antigua is 108 square miles in circumference and known for its crystal beaches, 365 in total, one for every day of the year. My research and thesis aim to explore the under-recognised influences of the island on the wider world. The Farleys are representatives of many planter families on the island of Antigua, and they're chosen as the subjects for this thesis as the family owned and worked at Mercers Creek Estate, one of the last stone estate houses on the island of Antigua. The existence of the estate and its artefacts, as well as the access provided, offer valuable source material. Furthermore, the Farleys' business operations were unique. During Francis Farley's ownership of the estate, he moved more than 100 enslaved people from the Mercers Creek Estate in Antigua to his newly acquired land in North Carolina and Virginia. The movement of such a large group of enslaved people from one colony to another was rare at the time, owing to the laws that prohibited the mass movement of enslaved people, predominantly due to fear of uprisings. Francis Farley's marriage into the prestigious Watkins Park family established his influence and business connections across Antigua, while the marriage of his son, James Park Farley, into the Byrd family of Virginia further solidified their social standing. Finally, the Farley family was selected to represent Antiguan planters in the 1700s, owing to the trail of legal paperwork created by Francis Farley's heirs during their legal disputes over lands with their cousins. Although papers relating to the Farley family are not as extensive as those of other Antiguan planter families, such as the Codringtons or Tudways, records do exist and provide a clear picture of why this influential family in Antigua moved almost entirely to North Carolina and Virginia. These documents also demonstrate the family's influence on the development of these two North American colonies. Using unpublished archival resources from Antigua, as well as the archival resources in the United States and United Kingdom, I explored the family's role in the development of North Carolina and Virginia. This was done by showcasing the impact and significance of these individual histories on global development in the 1700s, and thus providing a more definitive understanding of sugar plantations' actions and responses to changing circumstances in Antigua and the North American colonies in the 18th century. We do not have time today in this presentation to explore the history of the Caribbean island of Antigua, but for those of you who do not know, the island is located in the Caribbean Sea and named by Christopher Columbus in 1493, but not formally colonized with English settlers until 1632. The fertile land and water meant the island was first planted with tobacco until the arrival of sugarcane from Barbados created the booming industry from which families and nations' profits were made, built on the enslavement of African people. Francis Farley inherited the estate of Mercers Creek, along with a number of other smaller estates, such as Murray's estate and Hamilton estate, from his marriage to the prestigious Watkins family in Antigua. Eleanor Watkins' father, Samuel Watkins, was Chief Justice in Antigua for a number of years, and the family name was well known throughout the island. Francis' family's grandfather arrived on the island from Worcestershire, England in 1623 as a merchant. You'll see in the background of this slide, faded out unfortunately, a picture of the Mercers Creek estate in Antigua. Now, Francis Farley and his family were established landowners on the island of Antigua, comfortable in their wealth, land holdings, and social status, although life in Antigua was fraught with difficulties and threats. The cumulative effect of drought and starvation saw significant rates of death among the enslaved people and white planters. The sugarcane crop growth destroyed the once fertile soil, and a series of droughts saw disease run rampant. Fear of uprising from the enslaved due to the horrific conditions, exasperated by the drought and starvation, were further factors which compounded by the warfare with the French and Spanish. Finally, the outbreak of the American War of Independence, which ended the island's economic prosperity, and with it a way of life to which many of the white planters had become accustomed. As absentee landlordism increased, the cycle of decline continued, with diminishing investors and reduced outputs. Even when trade with the North American continent returned, the island's resources were replenished and the fear of death and revolt receded. Many of the planter class could no longer foresee economic prospects in Antigua. In 1779, Antigua renewed the seldom enforced preventing the escapees of debtors legislation, owing to the level of bankruptcy across the whole island. Those who could, including Francis Farley and his family, had been building their wealth and resources in greener lands. The colonies of North Carolina and Virginia offered a new opportunity that optimized the experience and resources they had obtained in Antigua, and the large wealthy families of Antigua's planter class began to move in numbers to a new land and greater opportunities. The wealth amassed in the Caribbean during this time was significant, all based on the success of sugarcane. However, the island's economic success was never published in print. E.G. Taylor's year-by-year survey of English geographical books and manuscripts between 1583 and 1650 demonstrates the limited number of Caribbean publications. In fact, the island never had their own printing press and rarely used the London press. It is noted that during the 17th century alone, Virginia Company sponsored 20 propaganda pieces. In comparison, the Caribbean colonies only sponsored 8. The planters became shadowy, half-forgotten men who were not inclined to write about themselves personally, either through letters or publicly, unwilling to highlight their newfound wealth to the authorities for fear of further taxation. Their wealth, however, is clear. Francis Farley had found El Dorado, for what all Englishmen of the time were searching for in Mercers Creek, Antigua. The time had come, however, for him to search for Eden, where his legacy could flourish and he could continue the legacy of his heirs in safety. Thus began Francis Farley's move to Virginia and North Carolina. North Carolina was selected by Francis Farley as there were Farley relations in the area. The influence that Francis Farley and his heirs exerted cover key sections such as the Dismal Swamp and the Surreytown, which will be explored in more detail over the following slides. Now, I'm not sure how many today are from North Carolina, and those who are, of course, have heard of the Dismal Swamp. Those listening from Antigua and other regions may have heard of the marshy area which crosses state lines through the US. Francis Farley was one of the 4 original investors in the establishment of the Dismal Swamp Company in 1753, which little is known about. He then joined a larger cohort of investors in the second Dismal Swamp Company, which included the future president George Washington in the 1760s. The aim of both companies was to drain the swampland and provide connections between the landlocked regions, providing key waterways for trade. The result was the 1805 Dismal Swamp Canal, which stretched for 22 miles, enabling trade in Chesapeake Bay, Virginia, and Albemarle Sounds, North Carolina. The waterway and its accompanying routes opened up the region for trade. Though Francis Farley had deceased decades before the impact of this development, his very involvement with the original and the successful project was significant. However, it should be noted there were severe negative impacts by dredging the swamp, both ecologically and for the maroon society who lived in the swamp. This included many freed slaves or runaway enslaved. By living in the Dismal Swamp, they were able to escape prosecution and persecution. Furthermore, the influences included Francis Farley's heirs' marriage into the Byrd family of Virginia, which gained further social standing for the family. Their later legal case against their cousins, Francis Farley's brother's children, who resided in England, formed part of the future laws of the newly created independent nation of the United States, following on from the American War of Independence. However, one of the greatest impacts and most significant to this presentation is the impact of Francis Farley and his heirs from lessons learned in Antigua and brought to North Carolina and Virginia through the movement of over 100 enslaved people from Mercers Creek Estate to Surrettstown. Francis Farley purchased a large tract of land advertised as the Land of Eden from William Byrd III in 1753. It is thought the tracts were won by Francis Farley in a game of cards with William Byrd III, a notorious gambler and even more notorious loser at gambling. The Surrettstown Land was located on the southern border of the larger tract of Eden, named after the Surrey Indians who had been seen in the area by William Byrd II, and which there will be an exhibition held at the museum later on this year. The movement of such a large group of enslaved people was unheard of at the time, mainly as it was illegal in the region to move enslaved people in large groups due to fear of uprising and ideas being brought from the perceived troubled Caribbean islands to what was seen as the safer white enclaves of the North American colonies. Farley is thought to have moved over 100 enslaved people to this land. The creation of the growth in tobacco and income that was required to succeed in the new North American mainland colonies depended on the use of enslaved people who'd been trained in Farley's way of working in Antigua. By this, I mean the main influences which had been accumulated through the sugarcane production work in Antigua, which was transferred through the movement of the 100 enslaved people to Surrettstown. These influences can be explained in four main categories. The first being missionaries. The arrival of the Moravian missionaries in 1756 and the Methodist missionaries in 1778 gained large support among the enslaved population on the island of Antigua. Francis Farley was one of a handful of supportive planters to the missionaries and their teachings. Although the details and numbers of Methodist converts within the ranks of those who lived and worked on the Farley estates is unknown, the proximity of the Methodist Missionary Center, neighboring Farley's Mercers Creek Estate in Antigua, and the same with the Methodist Society and Surrettstown in North Carolina is noteworthy. Similarly, Moravian missionary text refers to Farley on multiple occasions, and Farley visited the Moravian communities in Virginia. Moravians on the island of Antigua, with their core ideas and base developing in proximity to Farley's estate, offer one possible explanation as to why the land around Surrettstown in North Carolina was sold by the Byrd family, an extension of the Farley family by this point, to the Moravians to create the Selma community. When finished in 1771, the Selma community became the focal point for administration in the area, with the original community of Bethesda moving to Selma in 1772. Francis Farley is known to have visited the Moravian community that neighboured his Surrettstown land in Virginia. On the 29th of June, 1775, Francis Farley and his party crossed through the town of Selma, staying for 4 nights with Moravians, a long stay that can be attributed to his interest towards the Moravian teaching and cause in Antigua. On the 2nd of July, 1775, the day that Francis Farley left Selma, a Moravian enslaved man named Sambo escaped, followed by another enslaved woman called Valentine Frey. Escape in Virginia and North Carolina was noticeably easier than on Antigua, as the dismal swamp offered both coverage and an opportunity to live one's life hidden from recapture. Sambo's history and story was researched extensively by Rodenberg, and I've summarized it now. He was the son of an important man in the Mandalingo nation of West Africa, and he was sold to work on a plantation on the French island and then resold to Brother Hesbert in Selma to aid with his work as a tanner. Brother Hesbert believed he could convert Sambo to Moravianism, although Sambo only spoke basic French in his native language, so was unable to communicate. As Farley and the other enslaved persons he was travelling with departed, Sambo escaped. It is likely to join Farley's group in the hope or perhaps the knowledge of connecting with someone else from his nation. Sambo was returned to the Moravians after 27 days on the run, and is claimed in Freud's account that Sambo requested punishment, although he eventually converted to Moravianism and lived the rest of his days in the Selma community. In a nod to their religious beliefs, the Selma community was keen to note that they did not try to find or punish Sambo. The Moravians were not, however, willing to contradict and protest the laws of Virginia, which were harsh on all enslaved and black people. It is claimed the Moravians' records that Sambo returned on his own free will. And though Francis Farley continued to use enslaved labour in the operations of his sugar estates, his willingness to have both the Moravian and Methodist missionaries preach to those who were enslaved on his estate and perform baptisms was revolutionary at the time. The reason was twofold. He believed he was protecting his own soul in a variety of forms of religion and thought the Christian teachings were creating a more obedient people of those that were enslaved on his estates. Such teachings and religious conversions were transferred to North Carolina and Virginia along those 100 enslaved laborers. The second key area of influence was that of Samuel Martin, who was sent to Ireland following the murder of his father, Captain Samuel Martin Sr., by the enslaved on his estate in Antigua in 1701. The younger Martin was educated in England, returning to the island of his birth in 1716, and was shocked by the estate. In a bid to resurrect the success of the estate, Martin set up a programme that could be applied across the island to ensure profitability and growth. The programme incorporated a slew of measures, with the one most referenced in academic work today relating to the positive treatment and conditions put in place for the enslaved people. It should be stated clearly, however, that Samuel Martin's programme was not created to benefit the lives of the enslaved or ease their discomfort, but rather to maximise the profits that could be made from keeping the enslaved people healthy and working. The enslaved population on his estate consisted of 28.5% of the capital value of the estate as a whole, so the preservation of the enslaved labour force was of utmost economic importance and not morals. Samuel Martin's reforms were collected and printed as an essay upon plantership, with which there were multiple editions. Testing his ideas on his own estate, Martin spent considerable sums on rebuilding his sugar works, restocking and recreating spaces for the enslaved people. In his 1756 edition, An Essay on Plantership, Martin proposed more effective drainage systems and windmills, as opposed to mills run by animals, for the crushing of cane. He taught husbandry to the managers and white servants, providing adequate food and clothing to the enslaved people. Martin's methods and teachings became influential across the Sugar Islands, although his methods were picked up by his associate Francis Farley early on. Farley too encouraged the teachings of Christian principles to the enslaved and the creation of better conditions for those enslaved on his estates. Unlike the island of Antigua, which typically experienced high mortality rates, resulting in the importation of 1,700 to 2,000 enslaved people annually to counter the high rate of death, the production of tobacco in Virginia and North Carolina was seen as less intensive. The birth rates in Virginia matched the death rates, meaning the constant importation of enslaved people was not as necessary. The practices of Samuel Martin, when introduced into the estates in North Carolina and Virginia, also resulted in longer lives for the enslaved and greater birth rates. There were also significant alternative influences that were brought with the 100 enslaved people, as well as obviously what we just addressed of Samuel Martin's writings, the Methodist and Moravian missionaries. These included the techniques of the sugar planter on the island, which were radically different to techniques used elsewhere. Settlers attempted to replicate this on a grand scale in North Carolina and Virginia, which explains the spread of slavery from the Sugar Islands to the mainland North American colonies. The Antiguan origins of the enslaved on Francis Farley's estate, however, and their ability to retain some of their African culture and identity is notable. African names appear in the list of enslaved people who were at Syratown or who later sold as part of Francis Farley's granddaughter's estates. A 1799 list include the name Nancuts, Cudjoe, and Polden. It's surprising that several individuals were able to retain part of their African heritage with their name and comply they were also able to retain part of their practices and lifestyle. Finally, lessons learned from the severity of the Antiguan plantation living, such as the drought, starvation, which were referenced previously in this presentation, played a key role in the way in which the 100 enslaved people operated within the new Syratown community. And obviously, nothing can be said without the effects of the American War of Independence being addressed. The American War of Independence on this group are significant and enabled a community to grow which still exists in North Carolina today and with the focus of Charles Roderberg's research. The land and the people of the Syratown, the enslaved, the free, and the white, were left alone and rather isolated initially while the conflict between the 13 colonies in Britain took place. However, it became part of a more important north-south route, which had harsh results for the community. The Battle of Guildford Courthouse on the 15th of March 1781 saw the British hold the land, although the army of the 13 colonies inflicted heavy damages, resulting in several casualties. The Surreytown community would have seen the two armies racing to Virginia after the King's mountain troops under General Nathanael Greene and were chased by Lord Cornwallis and the British. After the battle, those who lived on the Surreytown estate provided medical assistance to Greene's men and assisted with the movement of troops to Speedwell Ironworks, southwest of the Surreytown community. It is likely that many of the enslaved people from the Surreytown community escaped to join the British in battle due to the promise of freedom. The grand estate home of James Park Farley, Francis Farley's son, became a military hospital during this time. Those who were enslaved were, in a way, able to benefit from the American War of Independence, either by gaining freedom when joining the British soldiers or because they obtained a greater semblance of peace and community development while the estates were not working at full capacity, without an overseer, widely known for their cruelty throughout the sugar colonies. Charles Rodderberg began compiling a slave biography from the 100 enslaved men and women who had been moved from Mercers Creek to Surreytown by Farley. Although the writing was still under construction at the time of Rodderberg's death, the information presented provides vital details of those who brought many lessons and methods from Antigua to North Carolina and Virginia. The work undertaken by Rodderberg from a collection in the Virginia State Archives in Richmond, the Library of Congress, and the North Carolina State Archives, and present a unique summary of the 100 enslaved people. The unpublished list's main source was that of the U.S. Circuit case of Dwindle, Crawford and Company versus Henry Skipworth, Elizabeth Hill Skipworth, et which Rodderberg discovered while researching in the Virginia State Archives. The 1805 case was brought against the heirs of the Farley family in relation to outstanding debts, but also preserved Francis Farley's will, as well as actions undertaken by Francis Farley's daughter-in-law's second husband, Reverend Dunbar, on behalf of Francis Farley's granddaughters. Rodderberg copied the legal papers from the Virginia State Archives, worried at the state they were left in, and believing there were no plans to catalogue or preserve them. These copies are now held in the Museum and Archives of Rockingham County, North Carolina. Charles Rodderberg was able to discover 8 slave lists relating to the land of Eden and the original enslaved people who'd been moved by Francis Farley from Antigua to the new land owned in the North American mainland colonies. Rodderberg aimed to compile a detailed DNA chart which showcased the original 100 enslaved people from Antigua and their ancestors in the region up until today, showing the impact of the enslaved on the region of North Carolina. Although Francis Farley continued to use enslaved laborer in the operations of his sugar estate, his willingness to allow both Moravian and Methodist missionaries to preach to those enslaved on his estates and perform baptisms, as well as his incorporation of Samuel Martin's teachings on the treatment of enslaved, were revolutionary for the time. These teachings and conversions were transferred to North Carolina and Virginia with his family, managers, and most importantly, the enslaved laborers. Both North American colonies experienced a rapid increase in Methodist and Moravian communities in areas neighboring Farley's land and visited by him. The close proximity to Farley's property in North America and the missionaries who'd been so successful in Antigua could arguably reveal an arrangement between the two groups which knew they worked well together. My further research on the connections between the Moravians, Methodists, and Farley in Antigua covers this in more extensive detail. However, unfortunately, we don't have time for that today. My research as a whole aims to present the influence and lessons learned by the people who were born on and lived in Antigua on the development of the young and newly independent North American colonies of North Carolina and Virginia. Antigua is 108 square miles with an estimated population of 100,000. 50% of the GDP is based on the tourism sector, with fishing supplying the local area and minimal agricultural production following the impacts of the sugar industry. Historical work undertaken on the island is not as extensive as it should be, with only a handful of historians and academics writing about the importance of the island. However, with projects and funds developing through the island, such as the recent Heritage Trust Antigua and Barbuda Inc., and the continued work of the national parks and English Harbour, I know the island will develop a greater training and educational opportunities for future generations and not allow the story of the island's history to disappear under the tourism banner 365 beaches, one for every day of the year. The island's history and influence is shared here today with the movement of 100 enslaved people from Antigua to Suritown, and is a great story which requires much more research and showcasing. History in Antigua is quite literally scattered all around. Francis Farley's bathhouse at Mercers Creek still stands tall, looming over the estate grounds. As the last stone estate house on the island, it's a sight to behold and one that many visit. However, it's the legacy of the 100 enslaved men and women moved again from their lives and homes, first in Africa and then Antigua, to create a thriving community, void of oppression for a period, enabling them to accumulate a new community, which I hope I have showcased here today and through my research. The island of Antigua offers so much more than its beaches for tourists. Its influence is more historical than a land once a mass of sugarcane, thick with the smell of boiling molasses. The sugarcane industry thrived on the exploitation of others while sucking nutrients from the earth. With the preservation of the people and the creation of the identity best showcased through the community at Suritown is what makes this research and history as a whole so exciting. And that brings me to the end of my presentation today about Francis Farley and the influence he brought from Antigua to North Carolina and Virginia. And I think there's been a few questions on the chat, oh no, there's no questions on the chat. So I open the floor for questions and return the mic to Cameron at the museum.
Hello, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Howell? Do you have any questions for Dr. Howell? Thank you so much for being here with us today, and thank you for everyone who's attended and spent their lunch hour working with us. I really appreciate it, and we're so thankful to have some great, amazing people a part of the museum to teach us such very cool things, to put it.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much for having me. And I have my email address can be shared. Obviously, if there are any further questions. And as I said, I hope that Charles Rodderbook's research continues. But this Suritown exhibition that the museum will be hosting later this year is really exciting.
And we actually started reading your thesis before before you spoke today. CJ found it and then he had us read it. So it was really cool learning up to it, and then kind of seeing you present it was really neat. Anything I need to add, CJ? Okay, I got his thumbs up.
Fantastic. Well, it's great. Thank you very much for having me today, and speak to you soon.
Thank you.